Welcome to today's program. I'm just going to wait a few minutes, maybe just 1 minute, for attendees to sign in here, and then we'll get started. We can all take this moment to relax, breathe in the wonderful air around us, smile because it's a beautiful day, at least where I am, hopefully everywhere, and we're going to have a great time. It is gorgeous where I am. I'm in San Francisco. A rare relatively cloudless day. Beautiful day for a webinar inside, as they say. They say in the industry, it's an industry saying. Give it about 10, 20 more seconds and then we'll get started. No pressure. No rush. That creak right there is my chair. I really should have oiled it up before I was going to go live online, but you know, we'll make our mistakes. All right. Okay, let's get started. Hi, my name is Alex Detmering, and welcome to the Global Spectrum of Risk. Before we get started with our core content, I wanted to go over a few details. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will be receiving the recorded version via email. Feel free to share the recording with anyone you think might be interested, friends, coworkers, whomever. It's really up to you. As you may have noticed, oh, and we're going to be sharing this recording via email tomorrow. As you may have noticed, everyone is muted, but you can still ask questions at any time using the question pane in your control panel. We won't answer the questions during the session following this, which is just a panel with Greg and Steve, but we will at the end of the webinar. As for the actual length of the pieces of the webinar itself, we have a 5-minute intro. This is part of it. And we have 20 to 25 minutes of panel discussion. And at the end, we're going to have about 20 to 25 minutes of Q&A. When this webinar does come to a close, along with your certification that you'll receive, we'll also be sending out, and the recording, we'll also be sending out a survey. Please, if you have time, maybe just 30 seconds to a minute, fill out that survey. It really helps us make the best possible programming for you all. We want to do that because we don't want to waste your time, and we love doing good work. So without further ado, let's begin the global spectrum of risk. So for most of Earth's history, change was really slow. Evolution could only go as fast as variations could be created, and that's only as fast as organisms can reproduce. Only a handful out of the millions and millions of organismal variations were actual improvements. And that's where humans come in. See, we're a little special. We have a different killer app than the rest of biological universe. We don't rely on hardware changes to evolve like most other organisms do. Instead, we prefer adaptation at the software level. We create ideas, tons of them, and really fast. And the ideas that worked are stored and passed down through culture. Strictly from a survival perspective, and you see here a graph of human population in millions versus extinctions over time. From a survival standpoint only, this method is working brilliantly. But like most things, there's a catch. There's actually several catches, but the one we're going to focus on right now is the fact that we no longer use our ideas to adapt to natural environments. Instead, we use them to adapt to environments that we created with our ideas. So our environments now change faster than they ever did. And this pace of change exposes us to risk. Yep, and lots of it. And for nearly every professional in every field, mitigating this risk is an existential battle. The challenge takes on a number of forms for compliance professionals, but the risks of running a global compliance program is near the top. And that brings us to today's core content, what Steve and Greg are going to spend the majority of this webinar discussing. Today, we're going to tackle two topics. The first topic is emerging trends in global risk and how compliance teams can focus their efforts according to the current state of risk. And the second is the complexity of global name variation and how that impacts account creation, customer due diligence, and screening. Today, we have the experts, Steve Cohen, who is a COO from Basis Technology, or COO of Basis Technology, and Greg Pinn, Head of Strategy at Merlon, to tackle these topics. I'm going to introduce them in just a second. Let's see. There we go. And stop showing screen. Hello, Steve. Hello, Greg. How about you guys introduce yourselves, and then we'll get started into the questions. Greg?
Greg, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Greg Pinn. I'm head of strategy for Merlon, Merlon.ai. We are the leaders in adverse media investigations, AI-powered adverse media investigations. Steve?
Thanks. So thanks for the intro, Alex. And I wish I could say it was as pleasant here as it is out in California where you are, but it's kind of cloudy here today. So I'm Steve Cohen. I'm a COO and co-founder of Basis Technology. We produce technology for text analytics with a strong focus on making the world a safer place, which is to say that we spend a lot of time using our text analytics tools in the areas of both national security and risk mitigation for companies, a lot of them being financial institutions.
Awesome. Well, great to have you guys here today. Greg, I'd like to get things started with you. And my first question for you really is, how has risk evolved over the last 10 to 20 years?
You know, it's been an interesting evolution over the last, really, if you look at 20 years ago where we were from a financial risk perspective, you know, that would be just before the 9/11 attacks, meaning just before the USA Patriot Act. I know it's strange for us all to think that that was almost 20 years ago. But pre-USA Patriot Act, the Bank Secrecy Act really had a very limited amount of heft behind it. Back then, we were seeing fines in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I remember in the first years that I was in compliance, the largest fines we had seen were in the low millions. And if we look at the fines that we've seen in the last couple of years, we're now talking about fines in the billions of dollars and really upwards into over $10 billion. And so we can look at this as in two different areas. One is how is the risk evolving, and then the other is how is compliance evolving. From a risk perspective, this is, let's look at this in the long term, and then let's really focus on sort of the last year as well as it relates to COVID. Where we've seen risk increase is the sophistication in criminals using the financial system for moving illicit funds, whether that's organized crime, money laundering, war crimes, human trafficking. We've seen considerable sophistication in how those institutions, those individuals' institutions, get around existing regimes. A lot of where this has pushed the focus is that simple sanctions and PEP screening are not able to capture these kinds of risk. There's only about 20 to 25,000 individuals and entities who are sanctioned globally, where there are millions of people around the world, unfortunately, who are involved in these high-risk activities. If we start taking a bit of a more of a targeted view as how has risk evolved in the last few years, I think we see a lot of risk and compliance response to shell corporations and other hiding behind other funds with things like requiring ultimate beneficial ownership screening. And then we get to where we are today in sort of the COVID landscape. And while obviously COVID has created a lot of strain and pressure and difficulty for billions of people around the world, as with any situation, whether it's a natural disaster, a human-made disaster, or in this case, a pandemic, bad actors always come out of the woodwork to prey on those who are most vulnerable. And that is the really unfortunate part of an event like COVID. Beyond the human toll and the financial toll is how much people are abused by bad actors. We've seen cases of PPP fraud, where companies that shouldn't be getting money from the government are taking that money, meaning that other companies, it's a non-infinite pool of money, and so other institutions simply couldn't get access to those funds. And really, the worst of this that we've seen are elderly, mainly elderly people, a lot of elder fraud, of being able to, people that got stimulus from the government, whether it's US government or governments elsewhere, and then got emails or phone calls saying they had to return that money and sending those money to fraudsters. And this has been an area in the last year that, while we've been focused on trying to work in this new regime, there's been a considerable focus, I think, from within the anti-money laundering world on how do we ensure that we're also continuing to target these emerging threats.
So I'd like to add on top of that, I mean, there's a fantastic summary in just a few minutes there. I like to look at these things from the sort of the larger context of the changing environment. You used the term before, Alex, talking about how humans have changed their environment. One of the critical aspects is we've created this opportunity for an online virtual environment that's way bigger than the environments that people had to deal with in general in the past. Unless you were Genghis Khan and actually traversing an entire continent, people's lives were much, much smaller. And I like to use the example of in the US, say in the mid-50s, if you had a banking transaction, be it taking out a loan or even depositing, you would go down, you would sit at a desk, and the banker who knew you or likely knew someone who knew you could confirm that you were someone they were willing to do business with. Well, that's changed. It started changing even before the internet, but the internet, of course, accelerates everything it touches. And we have a vast acceleration of the growth of the tribes that we have to deal with, the growth of sort of that environment, the human environment we have to deal with, and the separation because it's so much bigger. And these problems, like people, the wrong people getting PPP loans, are in large part because there's no way the government could know all of the recipients. And so they distribute that responsibility down to banks, but even those banks don't know, or maybe aren't so careful about checking to make sure they have it all right. And so the computers have not created the problem, but we've magnified the problem by virtue of the velocity and the variety and the distance we have between the transactees.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I think it really touches on one of the fundamental challenges that many smaller institutions have of getting away from this idea that you are a local bank. There are no local banks. All banks are global. All banks transact globally, whether you're a small regional bank and you're transacting remittances back to another country, or you're dealing with cross-border payments and purchases. Every bank is global, and the idea that you know who your customers are because of firsthand knowledge is a thing of the past, the very, very distant past at this point, and taking a much more mature view of who am I doing business with, and really, do I know them fundamentally? Do I know everything I could know about these individuals? Really brings up a very key area of understanding and mitigating that risk.
That's an excellent point, Greg. I wonder if you could kind of follow up and just discuss just more ways in which, I mean, you've covered a little bit of COVID risk, cover more ways in which the landscape of the risks that compliance professionals have to be keeping top of mind are. How lay out those changes?
I think this is an area that to me is incredibly interesting and provocative, but not an area that I think enough light is shown on. A lot of people, we have our preconception as to where risk lies in the world. So we think of whether it's human smuggling, whether it's slavery, whether it's war crimes, And I think it's important to sort of introduce some of those concepts. War crimes is a great example of that. When we think of war crimes today, most of us, I'm guessing, would think of one of two parts of the world, either the Middle East, specifically Syria, or Syria or Lebanon, or sorry, not Lebanon, Libya, or you think of what's going on in China with the Uyghur population. And those are the two areas that I think are get most of the focus of war crimes. While that's true and should get attention, there's a lot of movement right now happening in Guatemala for war crimes that happened decades ago. And so in the last, so from the 60s to the 80s, there was a huge genocide in Guatemala against the native Mayan people. And it's only now, 40 plus years later, that we're seeing some of the perpetrators of that risk come to justice. And so this is the area where financial firms or anti-money laundering organizations need to step up and make sure that they're aware and can put a stop to people evading capture. In war crimes, often capture can take decades. In this case, it has been decades, almost half a century. But that doesn't mean that these people should get around what is sort of due to them and the justice that their victims need. If we look at piracy, I think piracy is something that's gotten a lot of attention, specifically from that Tom Hanks movie. And most of the piracy that we think of is around sort of Somalia, the Gulf of Aden, the Horn of Africa, sort of all of that East African area by the Saudi Peninsula. And historically, that really has been where a lot of piracy has been. Unfortunately, a lot of that has been mitigated, I think, probably because of a lot of the attention that the Tom Hanks movie got. But that doesn't stop these individuals from committing the crimes that they commit. And so what we've seen is a lot of piracy has moved from the east side of Africa, rather to the west side, to the Gulf of Guinea. We see this around sort of Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Cameroon, that sort of area, Sub-Saharan West Africa, where a lot of piracy is going on in those sorts of areas as goods are coming into and out of that part of Africa. Obviously, in Lagos and Nigeria, there's a lot of trade that happens, Nigeria being the most populous country in Africa. And so being able to identify the piracy there and therefore help to stop that becomes critical. As we look at other areas, there's a few others that I think are critical to point out. One obviously is wildlife crime. Wildlife crime is a little bit more recent of a predicate offense. And the area, and this gets different amounts of attention. Obviously, poaching has been a huge topic for a long time. There's a lot of organizations that work with that. But an area that to me is, wildlife crime is in this area of being able to save those, whether humans or not, who have no ability to protect themselves. The pangolin being a perfect example of this. Pangolin is a small scaled mammal, sort of like a rodent size. And they're almost impossible to breed in captivity, meaning that they have been trafficked almost to extinction, eaten as a delicacy and also believed to have medicinal cures, unproven medicinal cures, I should say. And so this is an area where throughout Southeast Asia into the Middle East, we've seen huge amounts of trafficking of the pangolin. And there's a lot that can be done. The pangolin sort of being the species that is most apparent because it's such a unique creature. And it's unique, it's the only scaled mammal. And so saving these sort of unique creatures becomes critically important. When we look at wildlife crime, we also need to look at environmental crime. And this happens a huge amount in places like Bangladesh, in India, in Congo, in all sorts of sort of lower income parts of the world where multinational firms ship their industrial trash and electronics. And so what you have is huge fires that rage in these parts of the world to burn off the metals or to melt off the metals out of what is incredibly toxic materials. And so you have this huge toxic fires that burn so that because it's the easiest and least expensive way to get access to these metals. You have a similar thing in Bangladesh with the extraction of iron and other metals from vessels and cruise ships. And so these are sorts of areas where it's first world companies shipping their problems into the third world to try to make that problem seem invisible. And this is an area where as financial crime professionals, we can have a material impact. The last one I want to touch on, and I could obviously go on about this for quite a while, which is sort of a sad state of affairs. Actually, two that I want to touch on, and both of those impact the health of human beings. The first is smuggling, and smuggling specifically in Pakistan. Smuggling in Pakistan around tea has become a huge problem. Hundreds of millions of dollars in tea is smuggled into Pakistan every year. Obviously, it's a part of the world that drinks a lot of tea. The problem is that while the smuggling on the surface is to get around import taxation, what ends up happening is that a lot of the smuggled tea is diluted with things like animal blood, asbestos and other chemicals, wood chips and wood dust, things like that, to basically, you take whatever waste materials you can find and you mix it with tea, which, obviously, we all know how dangerous asbestos can be. And if you're making asbestos tea, that is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And so this is an area where on the surface, you've got something like smuggling, which is normally a tax crime, which is now having huge health impacts on the community. And the last one I want to cover is human trafficking. Human trafficking obviously being a huge problem everywhere in the world. I think it's a problem that as Americans we like to ignore and believe sort of happens over there. But to put it in context, approximately 400,000 people are held in some sort of slavery in the United States at any given time. 400,000 people. And we look at where those people come from and where they're trafficked, it's from the most desperate people in the world. And right now, a lot of those people are coming out of Venezuela. And so we see individuals who may hire smugglers like coyotes to smuggle them to different countries. Unfortunately, a lot of the women and girls who start out being smuggled end up being trapped in human slavery, and often sexual slavery, and held as sex slaves for years or decades. And so it's everything from environmental crime and wildlife crime, and understanding where did these things happen, and then therefore how do we track them better as people on the front line of these sorts of risks.
So I'd just like to add, I'm not going to add any more categories to this extensive rogues catalog of criminality types. Even though, as you said, there's more. I want to point out that any one of those, or multiple, all of them, in fact, are often used in conjunction with each other and in conjunction with issues that affect national security. As I said earlier, we spend a lot of time working with national security folks in several countries, and there's a very deep connection between, say, smuggling being used to fund terrorism. And I think that can be said for virtually any of those criminal enterprises. They generate money, and the money can be used to corrupt the process and often be used to fund terrorism somewhere. So there's a very strong connection in our minds between the information, the data that you need for national security investigations and discovery, and the information you need for financial compliance requirements. And of course, that's by design, that a good number, if not most, of the entities on those lists are there because they have some connection to some national security concern, like terrorism.
Yeah, Greg, I want to say, I mean, actually, Steve and Greg, with both of these things that you guys just kind of added on the end, like, I think it can be very easy sometimes to think of the compliance challenge here as like some kind of, institutional risk mitigation thing alone. But really, I mean, there are people whose lives are impacted by the quality of work here, right? I mean, doing this
100%.
well doesn't just mean, I'm not going to get sanctioned, and I don't want to get sanctioned, which, I mean, that's understandable. It also means maybe you save someone's life, and that does happen. So I just think I appreciate the examples that you gave, because it really just allowed us to zoom in a little bit on the human toll that this activity takes out on the world, and just how important it is to do it right.
And I think it's you bring up a very interesting point. I think it's an area that a lot of compliance analysts get very frustrated about. That you file a SAR, you feel that something horrible is happening. You file a SAR, you do all the right thing, and because of the nature of SAR reporting being anonymous, you never hear back unless you're going to be really diligent about reading it in the news. And a lot of these things will never be in the news. You never really hear the results of your actions. And it's, we, in the years and years that I've been doing this, I've had numerous financial institutions come to me very quietly and say, we reported something to the FBI and it saved, 10, 20, 30 people being trafficked for human slavery because of things that we were able to find through these tools. And so it's, often we get lost in the bureaucracy and the process and the fines and the reputational risk, and all of that does matter. But at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. There are human beings at the end of the line here who, if we do this right, when we do this right, the lives saved is huge. There's an example I used to give a lot when the World Trade Center was bombed the first time in '93. There's this very dramatic sort of scene of the FBI agent and the terrorist who planned the attack flying in a helicopter over the World Trade Center. And he said, look, the building is still standing. And the response that the guy gave back was, it wouldn't be if I had more money. And so you look at terrorist attacks around the world, money is really what can, restricting the flow of money can have a material impact on saving the lives of people in both big and small ways.
That's beautiful, man. I think that is the best lens, I think, to look at this whole issue through. On that, I mean, you just laid out, and both you have just numerous different kinds of risks, different trends that are occurring in like global criminality. Like, how does a compliance team keep track of this stuff, just given how much of it's going on, how fast it's changing, the variety of it? Like, how do you approach that from a technical standpoint?
I think the big thing is that, risks move fast. And, this is the same reason that, there was actually a really interesting article published this weekend about the Ross Ulbricht, who's the Silk Road guy, and sort of the case leading up to finding him, and how law enforcement relies on very innovative technologies to conduct those investigations and bring those people to justice. And something so interesting that, like, they knew that if he closed his laptop, everything would be encrypted. So they had to physically catch him in a way that he couldn't close the laptop. And so, understanding those things and bringing in the new technologies applies just as much to AML. So often we see financial institutions using 10, 20, 30-year-old technology to solve modern challenges and modern obligations. And it's a crazy type of solution. It's like trying to put bicycle tires on a Ferrari. It's just simply not going to work.
Yeah.
Your challenges are big. Your solutions need to match those challenges. You need to look at innovative.
Sorry, Greg, but that's the point I was making earlier in the intro, that the problems, if not created by, are strongly exacerbated by the technology. And just using the old tools just can't keep up. I mean, we all know that the first people to use newer tech are very often the bad guys.
Yeah.
And so if we don't deploy newer technology, if we don't use the latest and greatest, then there's no way we can keep up. Your analogy, the bicycle versus Ferrari, absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, this came to a head to me a few years ago when we were working with a financial institution, trying to get them to upgrade their web browser. This is probably 3 years ago, and they were using Internet Explorer 6. And their attitude was, we use it because we think it's the most safe. And it's like, well, it's objectively not the most safe because they stopped patching it a decade ago. And they were like, well, change is scary. And the problem is you have to have this idea we live in a technological world. You have to be innovating. You cannot, the more you sit in old technologies, the more you open up your business to risk.
Yeah, I think that concept, by the way, or the alternative applies to everything, which is if you think change is scary, think of how it's really much scarier to not change, right?
Yeah.
And that applies to the use of technology. It applies to practices and processes, because a lot of compliance, and you certainly hear this a lot from folks inside the financial industry, that it's not just that the technology may be less good than they'd like, but there's processes and practices that either emanate from the regulatory institutions or within the bank itself that are less than fully productive, that really could be improved and made more efficient.
I think right now is a great place to turn to our next topic, as we've gone deep in here, and we haven't even touched technical questions yet, which hopefully we'll get to in the Q&A. So before we get into name matching problems, I want to bring up our first poll question today regarding the global risk landscape. So let's go ahead and bring that up here, and everyone can vote. So do changes in the global risk landscape keep you up at night? Really looking for a ranking here. Yeah, definitely, kind of, not really, or not at all as possible answers. We've got 20% votes so far, 30%. If I can get up to about 50, I'll go ahead and close the poll, but no rush. Take your time, answer honestly. Give us your gut.
It's always this is such an interesting question, because global risk landscape today and global risk landscape pre-COVID is probably a very different world.
Yep.
And I think it's hard to separate those, especially as compliance professionals.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me go ahead and share the results. We got 50% respondees chiming in here. Do changes in the global risk landscape keep you up at night? 40% said definitely, 20% said kind of, 40% said not really, and no one said not at all. So with that, I want to change the topic of discussion to global name matching as a risk. So Greg, once again to you, how important is strong name matching in a global compliance program?
I think it's absolutely critical, and I think we so often get into a very unintentionally xenophobic view of names. I don't think this is an area that people necessarily are prejudiced, but it is an area where what we are used to becomes so prejudiced. Things like that your given name comes first, or that your last name is most likely your father's last name. These are very Western, very American things, but are not true globally. And understanding that becomes critical for not just doing individual screening, but starting to build those networks and understand relationships between individuals, between parents and children, between siblings, spouses, all of that. Steve?
Yeah, I would add to that. Greg, you talked about how the name order may vary somewhat. There are so many different ways that names vary. And this really comes about from the fact that languages vary so much. As I said, we're a text analytics or natural language processing company, so linguistics is core to what we do. And there's a particular linguistics that applies to names. It's called onomastics, and it studies how names relate to the language and how they relate within the language. We worry a lot about how they vary across languages. So you have things like name component order variation. So in Asia, often it's the last name first, first name last. And it's an easy mistake to make if you meet someone from Asia to wind up thinking you're calling them by the first name and actually calling them by their last name, which of course they'd actually be used to. And then you have details like nicknames. Nicknames often are shortened version or slightly modified version of a name, but sometimes they're completely different. Jack and John, for instance, Jack is a nickname for John. It bears little resemblance to the name John. and Elizabeth and Buffy. That bears zero resemblance, at least to my mind, and yet that's a very common nickname. So nicknames are particularly, shall we say, deviant variation. We have in many cultures, certainly Western cultures, the ability to use just a single initial sometimes on a form. I could write S. Cohen, and that's perfectly valid. The list goes on and on. We have about a dozen or so different ways that we see names vary. And as I said, the key thing here is that they vary within a language because languages vary so much. Then you have the issue of what happens when they vary between languages, because as we talked about earlier, we're more connected. We're also very mobile. And so someone whose name is written very clearly a certain way in Arabic, like let's just take Muhammad, most common Arabic male name, is written exactly one way in Arabic, but we've seen, well, I'd say about 100 different ways that can be transliterated or turned into what we would call an English, air quotes, or a Latin script spelling. Simple things like, is it M-O-H or M-U-H? Are there two M's in the middle? The list goes on and on. So names vary in so many different ways. And yet names are used as, I refer to them as the primary key, a database concept. They are the starting point for establishing identity most of the time. That may not be true in 10 years or 20 years, but today, the first field on the form for a bank sign up or for just about anything else is a name. And it may be broken down into different fields or it may not be. And then the last variation that's very common is humans, either the person you're talking who's opening the account or the person who's listening to them in order to open the account, make a lot of mistakes. And so you're just going to have accidental variation.
Yeah, to just jump on that, I think the Muhammad example is so interesting because there are so many people in the world named Muhammad. It becomes all the more interesting with young men who are now taking the abbreviation Mo for Mohammed, because now you've expanded. It's Mo can now mean Maurice, or from sort of a more Italian descendancy, or Mohammed from a more Arabic descendancy. And so the name Mo has just sort of exploded in usage. There are a couple other ones that I think are worth pointing out as well. One is the Latin American construct of names, where the last name is in some jurisdictions, Spanish jurisdictions, the father's last name followed by the mother's last name. And in Portuguese jurisdictions, the mother's last name followed by the father's last name. And it's made all the more complicated based on how that person, where the person grew up, where they've originated from. If you've got someone who came from Chile, lived in Brazil for a while, and then moved to the US, any combination of those names are accurate, and the switching of the names is even accurate. And so it makes it so much more difficult. Even within the US, we had a case, for those of you that have been following the post-election news, there was a case of a woman who, of a name of, it was someone who was accused of being a person who voted after they were deceased. And it turned out that the actual voter, the woman went by her husband's name. So it's like Mrs. Richard Clark. And that was a very common way in the early 20th century, far less common now, but her voter registration was under Mrs. Richard Clark. Her late husband, Richard Clark, had passed away, didn't vote. She voted legally, but as Mrs. Richard Clark. And so even within jurisdictions that we think we understand, there's so much differentiation.
That's an excellent example, Greg. Now I want to ask kind of a question that I'm going to pose a little bit to both of you. So first of all, we've gone kind of like a myriad of ways in which names can be kind of dirty, and comparing them can be difficult. How is that tackled technically? So that's my question to Steve. And Greg, my question is, like, really, what kind of havoc or problems can this cause within a compliance process, and how can a smoother or more streamlined approach really make this screening go all the better? So I really want to ask Steve first, how do you approach this technically?
So as I said, we categorize the types of name variation into a number of buckets, and it's about a dozen different types of variation. And then we look carefully at each of those to figure out what kind of rule set or modeling scheme is the most useful to treat that as a standalone. We do not have a single one model to rule them all strategy for comparing two names. We find it's a lot more efficient and effective if we break it down. So for each of these dozen different dimensions of name variation, we have a model where sometimes the model is very simple, a set of rules or a list, and some of them are modern AI, again, air quotes, AI/machine learned models that have learned based on a human input training set, what are the different variations that are considered a match by people. That's how we construct it, and then you wind up building a composite model. You run all of these and you look at the answer and figure out whether, when you put it together, whether these two names are likely to match. And at the end of the day, it's important to note, this is all a statistical process. With very few exceptions, you're not going to get the answer. You're going to get the likely answer. And there's dials and knobs to figure out what the institution wants to call likely answer. And right, so those can be controlled. But at the end of the day, what you have is a likely answer that for certain processes like due diligence still winds up on the desk of an analyst. What we've done is help the analyst, not replace them.
Yeah, and I think this is an area where the name matching is sort of one component of the larger technological innovation of looking at how do we remove from the analyst things that human beings are just really bad at. One of the things that we've been very focused on from Merlin's perspective is removing the need to review huge libraries of articles, because people are really bad at very repetitive tasks. People get tired, angry, frustrated, hungry, hot, cold, whatever. And in the world of COVID, with constant distractions around us, being able to focus on these things becomes ever more difficult. And so when you look at this from an end-to-end solution, it's about having better quality name matching, getting much more advanced than sort of SoundX and these historic approaches, looking at how do you focus your name matching, and then how do you also incorporate tools into your entire pipeline that eliminate the need for this sort of very tedious, error-prone work.
Excellent point, Greg. And a great moment right now for us to transition into our Q&A. So everyone, get your questions ready. But before you do that, we do have one more poll, and that's going to show up in just a second here. So is global name matching a problem for your compliance program? Same kind of ranking here, definitely, kind of, not really, not at all. Got a few, got 20, 30% in now. Don't wait for 50 again. So far, one of them is leading, to be announced. Not going to give away the prize.
Suspense is killing me.
I know. I'm a master of storytelling, Greg. I really am.
Well, maybe if you told people there was a prize, then they would.
Yeah, I know. That's the secret. We give about 20 more seconds here for voting. Is global name matching a problem for your compliance program? And go ahead and gonna close the, now there you go. The results are in. 50% said definitely, and 50% with a resounding kind of. Awesome, great. All right,
Well,
so
100%, it's at least kind of, right?
Yeah,
and that's just not surprising. That's
It
not
is.
surprising. We often, I mean, Greg, I know you see the same thing, but who doesn't have an issue with false positives causing wreaking havoc on their workflow pipeline?
And I think worse is, name matching can often open you up to ensuring you're not missing those false negatives.
Yeah.
And the double-edged sword of that is good name matching will uncover false negatives, but bad tools will ensure that you've got such a mountain of false positives you can't even get to those. And so it is a balance. It's that give and take between expanding your risk profile while not getting buried underneath overwhelming results.
That's a great point, Greg. So while I'm waiting for some questions to roll in, I had a follow-up with Greg that I wanted to ask. So I mean, we had just like begun to cover kind of how to approach keeping track of changes in the global risk landscape, technologically speaking. And I just wanted to kind of hear more from you on that. Like, really, what does a new approach to risk management look like?
Sure. I think let's take a look at the old approach first. And the old approach, really looking back 20 years or even 10 years, was a march to data. Basically data hungry hippos. So each vendor, just like in Hungry Hippos, paying homage to Steve's background here, just like in Hungry Hippos, each vendor was trying to grab licenses and grab access to more and more content. And this was a huge challenge for decades. That challenge we've solved. It's been solved by all of the data vendors. It's been solved over and over again. And so the difference from one data vendor to another is in the details and the noise. All of them provide hundreds of millions of articles. Really, where the challenge lies is in accessing that information in a targeted way. And that's where all of these institutions, these legacy players, have really been falling asleep, is this idea that, well, we provide you with data, you just need to provide an army of people to go process that. And like I mentioned before, armies of people reading articles are not good at that. And so where we've approached this is from the other side of saying, this is not a data challenge. The data challenge has been solved. The challenge now is, how do you make sense of the data? How do you integrate it and bring it together? And how do you rely on new technologies to make that happen effectively? And looking at it from that perspective gives you very different answers than the sort of data only focus.
Yeah, that is a common theme across all of the solution spaces that we sell into. Folks in the search business have used the needle in the haystack analogy so much that no one likes to touch it anymore. But it doesn't really make it any less relevant. It really is, the haystacks are there. There's no problem collecting the data. There's no problem actually searching the data. You can submit a query to very large data sets and get responses very quickly. The key word and the key words in what Greg said is making sense of it, so that at the end of the day, what you really want to do is reduce the volume down to the most relevant information that you put in front of the analyst to do that final analysis, to do the final determination of what matters and does this deserve, say, a SAR written about it.
And I think that's the part where people are so essential, is in that final analysis. It's in all of that pre-analysis sifting that we're able to now bring technology that just didn't exist before.
Yeah, I mean, with every advance in technology, we're kind of like giving away things that we no longer need to do to kind of like outside technologies so that we don't have to keep them in our head, right? And this is just another one of those cases. I mean, we have calendars, super simple technology, right? So we don't have to like think about all our obligations ahead of time. And we can't imagine a world without calendars. It's like every innovation is like that. We're just externalizing what we used to be in human brains and what can be done better and by machines at this point. And we're just reaching like a critical mass here, and we just need. I feel like the scale just needs a tip, right? I think in the webinar before you said we need to go from gills to lungs, right? And so that really brings us to the question of transition. Like, how do you, I mean, that's a, thinking about going from one environment, one regime to another regime is really scary. How do you approach that within a big bank? You're thinking, okay, from time, I started 10 years ago and we've always been using, I don't know, Google Alerts or whatever it is, right, to keep track of all this stuff. Like, how do I think about bringing out a whole new system, learning a whole new workflow? Like, that's scary.
Yeah, and
I know that Greg is the expert here. I want to make two quick points. One is I think we collectively made the point before that change is not bad, that change is good and in fact necessary. And the other is that I see, and I'm sure Greg will talk about this, I see more of an interest on the consumer side or the enterprise side of adopting something that resembles the way companies develop software now, which is agile. To use something that's, and agile inherently means in part adaptable. So I mean, that's what I think I see. Go ahead. Sorry, Greg.
No, sorry, Steve. I think the big change that institutions need to really take, and we've started seeing this slowly, is really a way like getting away from the enterprise mindset of everything has to be a 3-year project, everything has to be built in-house, everything has to be built in on. It's the mainframe idea, and seeing the mainframe concept really break down, starting in hardware probably 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now really as a mindset that you don't have to do things in these sort of huge mainframe ways. I mean, just as an example, the way that it works with us at Merlon is we encourage our customers not to go and replace thousands of users overnight, but replace a department or a team and start merging this into your workflow steadily. So that instead of sort of trying to change all the wheels on the car while the car is moving, let's just change a little bit at a time. Keep that car moving. Let's not disrupt the flow as much as we can. And as teams are freed up based on using our technology, using new offerings, those people can then be reassigned to other more pressing issues as well, whether that's around cryptocurrency or UBO or the other challenges that institutions face.
That's an excellent point. Just a kind of a more grounded question. I mean, what kind of changes do you think the implementation of these sort of more advanced AI tech approaches to screening or to monitoring global risks, like what's the bottom line impact here? For Greg and Steve, question both of you guys.
Sure. So we've seen huge reductions in analyst costs and analyst workflow. I think the biggest change that we've seen is not necessarily moving people out of their jobs. That's obviously not the intention. There's too much work for the people that are in it today, but rather focusing attention where human brains work the best and moving people away from tasks where human brains don't work well. We've covered that a lot this afternoon. And so really what we've seen is investigations that used to take between 3 and 8 hours, taking between 10 and 20 minutes, because all of that, because machine learning and natural language processing does most of the work instantly for the user that used to be spent going through and reading and processing articles manually. And the more that we can remove these very manual, tedious tasks, that the better quality results the financial institution will have and the more risk that they're able to mitigate.
So I gave the example earlier, or I mentioned the problem that we hear from everyone with false positives. And the reason for this is because false positives cost money, and as Greg pointed out, they also clutter up the system and make it harder to find the false negatives. So using technology, we have a couple of examples like this. You can see, say, an 80% reduction in false positives. There's definitely your mileage may vary and asterisk goes here and all that, but we've seen those kind of improvements. And if you can take your false positive rate down by 80%, you can both take your costs down, but you can also ultimately, I believe, enhance or reduce the false negative rate, even if the technology doesn't. And the technology does. We have good examples out of U.S. Customs and Border Protection of directly reducing both false positive and false negative numbers. So if you're able to reduce both of those by substantial amounts, you can save money and improve your performance, improve your accuracy at the same time. It's really win-win.
Which is really the goal of like what we've been talking about. I mean, this entire time, right? It's not just you're saving, you know, you're saving money on personnel costs, right? It's also that you're uncovering real risks, and these real risks are tied to actual people's lives and bad guys and innocent. You know, this is a criminal drama that we're trying to uncover here, and what these technologies present us with is an opportunity to make a bigger impact, and this is what we're here to do.
I really will go back to a point we all made before, in that we started by talking about fines very early on, and it's certainly, you know, our marketing and Merlon's marketing talks about fines, because fines is how you scare people to pay attention, and they are a real problem as business people, right? You don't want to be paying $1 billion, but to be able to reduce the financial risk to your company while also delivering better social benefit in the form of knowing that you're saving any number of people from slavery or reducing smuggling. Again, it's win-win-win. It's win all around. And you know, the key thing to me is the technologies are there. Deployment takes effort. Redesigning systems and processes takes effort, but the ROI is not a 3-year ROI if you deploy it the way Greg said. If you do it incrementally, you can start seeing ROI in months.
And you know, I'll say one of the things that's always sort of in the back of my mind is that compliance is one of the few things where you can do well and do good. And we can do well for ourselves and for our business, and we can do good for society and for the people that are victims of this. And so to me, you know, sort of focusing on, you know, at the end of the day, we're not about, you know, mitigating fines is important, reputational damage is important, but doing good for society is really what this is about at the end of the day.
That's beautiful. I think that's a great place to stop. Steve, Greg, I want to thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I learned, I'm sure everyone else enjoyed it too. I want to thank you all for coming. I hope it was valuable to you. We do our best. Just want to remind you that by attending this, you've earned 1 CAMS credit, and we're going to email you that certification soon after this webinar ends. Also within that email will be the survey. If you like this and you think we can do a better job, and we think we can do a better job in future productions, just tell us what you'd like to see, and we'll do our best to incorporate your advice. Thanks so much, and well, you have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Yep.